When we look back at the history of street tuner culture racing games, a lot of them were heavily inspired by the success of the popular Fast and Furious franchise. And long before we would even get the Need for Speed Underground series, we would initially get Midnight Club Street Racing, which would also be the first game in a very popular series that would run up until 2009, that would end really on the PlayStation 3. And this was before a time when open world games were really starting to become popular. Yes, we had the Driver series on the likes of the PlayStation 1, which were extremely popular on that earlier system. And believe it or not, that this game here actually came out before Grand Theft Auto 3, which would become one of the most popular open world games pretty much ever of that generation, even of all time. So this game even predated that and the Need for Speed Underground series, as it originally released not long after the PlayStation 2's launch in the year 2000, and it would release in North America, Europe and even in Australia. The game would later get a port to the Game Boy Advance in 2001 and 2002, which would feature a selection of different modes from single player, campaign or career, even with multiplayer features that you can play split screen against your mates. This game would essentially set the stage for one of the most popular street racing games ever. While there was the second game, Midnight Club 2, and it was a fairly decent game in its own right, but it just didn't have that level of impact, because around that time you did have Need for Speed Underground, but it wasn't until Midnight Club 3 and then later with the dub edition that came out that exceeded all expectations, as it was one of the best games of its type that equally rivaled that of Need for Speed of that time. When the game did release, it received generally favourable reviews, and estimated sales of both the PlayStation 2 version and even the Game Boy Advance version combined were well over 1.5, almost 2.5 million units. So for the first game in a series that was relatively unknown at the time, did quite well. So upon booting up the game, when you access the career mode, you are quite limited in the beginning as to the missions that you can undertake. You'll usually have to go through some dedicated scenarios and you'll have to achieve victory in races. So the player has to work their way up in the street racing world by defeating named opponents in various races. Ultimately, that will result in pink slips to win the opponent's car, with the game featuring 17 total cars, but you will only gain access to them through progressing through the career mode, and can range from anything from taxi cabs to buses and other types of vehicles. But then you will also later get access to the tuner culture vehicles with the likes of the Toyota, Nissan and Honda vehicles that will allow you to add body kits, add turbos, add NOS and add all of those elements to give yourself an advantage during races. So this is one of the earliest games of its type to allow for all of that customization within vehicles themselves within video games, which was pretty cool. Even with the multiplayer modes themselves, you had capture the flag, cruise, head to head and even waypoint. So they all had different specific scenarios that are objectives that needed to be completed in order to win. But even as you drive, in the early stages of the game you can go pretty much wherever you want, but you also have lots of destructible objects such as lampposts, trees, trash cans, and if you're not careful you will also have the cops chasing you. The one thing I will say about this game is it is a lot of fun, there's a lot to do, but it is quite difficult and very challenging. Even as a casual player, if you're just coming into it for the first time, it is very tricky to win a race. It will take quite a few attempts because the marker system or the compass that tells you where to go, it does give you an idea of where the endpoints are, but sometimes if you take the wrong direction, which will happen, it doesn't always give you the greatest sense of confidence in knowing where exactly to go, because sometimes it can lead you down the wrong path. And there is certain scenarios or races where there are certain events where you have to hit checkpoints. The problem is that your opponents are usually 10 steps ahead of you and they will have the race over and done with before you've even hit the third or fourth checkpoint, because they'll know the best routes to take. So it will take quite a few tries in order to get the best of it. But for those that persist, well, it's inevitable that you will see some level of success. But it is interesting to look back on it because, like I said, this was the start of something that would become massive in the realm of video games. This was one of the first games, if not the first game, to entirely do this with the tuner culture feature, because Need for Speed Underground wouldn't come out for at least another 2 years. So when we think of all of those type of games, Midnight Club Street Racing was the one that set the benchmark in the beginning. While it's not the best, granted, but it definitely was an early look into what these games could do and what was possible. Right, it's not as refined as later games or even other games in the same genre. It is much more difficult in many ways, but it's definitely worth playing if you want a challenge, or even just to get a glimpse of what these earlier tuner culture games would look like. There's just something nostalgic about it. Even the music in the game is very reflective of that early 2000s period, and it really suits the style of the game. It's interesting but tough, but if you're a fan of the series, or if you've yet to play any of the games, you should maybe take a look at this one. With that being said, this is but one of many street racing style games that did release on the PlayStation 2, as yes, there was quite a few. It was definitely a very popular time for video games, even just racing games. Quite possibly the most popular ever, even to the current day, and there was a lot more games yet to discover, which we will cover in this next video.